The deep state or permanent state is something that comes up a lot in modern political discourse. I find it something, though, that very often is not really explained. And a lot of the people who talk about it will often kind of come across as being a bit unhinged and grossly kind of exaggerate the concept to the point that it gets kind of absurd. Now, the concept of the deep state is wide used within modern politics. It's most famously associated with people who are dissidents or populist or anyone outside of the political mainstream. But you see it all the time within mainstream politics. They just aren't as extreme in how they characterize the deep state, but it's very common for politicians to blame the deep state for why they lost an election, why their political program failed, why they couldn't get legislation passed, that their policies were sabotaged. And it's also very common to accuse your opponent as a way of demonizing them of creating a deep state of rigging future elections. Now, on one hand, this thing could be seen as a complete and total conspiracy theory, and it's a way for incompetent politicians and incompetent fringe people who have ideas that in no way appeal to the public to excuse their lack of success and their inability to communicate. And on the other hand, it could be completely true, and there is a secret cabal that control all of the world, not just your country, not just America, but everywhere. The truth is, as with most conspiracy theories, there's a wide spectrum of belief. There, it ranges from the very straightforward and simple that few people would contest, to the extreme and absurd that borders on science fiction. For instance, let's take probably the biggest conspiracy theory of all time, 9/11. So if we want to go from like the most extreme to the least extreme, the most extreme position would be something like aliens did it. And then you could have maybe lower than that, the US government did it. And then you could have the US government knew about it but let it happen. And then you could have the US government knew about it but they were too incompetent to deal with it. And then you could have it that the US government was completely taken by surprise, or they were too incompetent in their intelligence gathering. So there's a wide spectrum of beliefs there, and each kind of rung you go down or go up, or however you want to refer to it, the more leaps of logic you have to take, the more layers of conspiracy you have to go down, the more people would have to be involved, the more people would have to be like deeply involved, and I guess kind of the more directed the entire thing was. Like an intelligence failure could just be literally like one or two incompetent people didn't send a report they were supposed to send, and it's pretty straightforward and you can track that down. Whereas if we're going to go into the US government did it itself, you would have to have like so many people involved in it, and so many documents and stuff like that. It does stretch belief a bit more, as the threshold is much higher. You also have within conspiracy theories the difference between whether it is a deliberate organization or a deliberate decision by people, or it's a phenomenon that exists with respect to certain circumstances. Like if we're going to look at the New World Order or the neoliberal world order or something, there's a variety of conspiracy theories ranging from there being like this cabal of pedophile Satanists that run the world to a bunch of rich people who have founded organizations like the Bilderberg Group in order to rig the system in their favor, to a number of different people who have shared interests who occasionally cooperate with each other, to rich people just behave in the same way worldwide, and the cumulative effect of all these wealthy people behaving in a similar manner is what leads to the current state of affairs. Now, I doubt anyone would really question the last one there, but the deeper you get and the more kind of extreme and the more it requires like the smoky room and stuff like that, the more you often will come across as being unhinged, or the harder it is for people to accept. And I think a problem is a lot of people will just go immediately to like satanic pedophiles run the world, rather than maybe talk about like Jeffrey Epstein, which is something that's 100% verifiable, and which I've honestly never met someone, even among very normal people, who thinks Jeffrey Epstein actually killed himself and thinks there wasn't some kind of cover up there. So, within that context, let's talk about what is the deep state or what is the permanent state. It's the idea that within government, and there's various versions of this. There's one that it only applies to government employees. There's ones that include the media and include NGOs and stuff like that. But there is some sort of force within government that is not accountable to popular sovereignty or popular will, that has its own agenda and will pursue this agenda regardless of what the people want or vote for. And like obviously the most probably well developed concept of this would be vanguardism, which is something that comes out of Leninism and normally speaking different types of fascism, in which you will have an inner circle who will control the one party state. They'll be the heads of the party or the heads of various ministries or the head of the secret police, and their job will be to keep political discourse within certain limits. So that being said, what is the deep state? Let's maybe just start at the most basic level. The deep state or the permanent state, you could say, are permanent employees of the government. That is bureaucrats. This includes but is not limited to civil servants, the police, firefighters, regulators, basically anyone who is a permanent employee of the government. And the idea is that these people all individually have their own agendas. Now, this agenda may range from them attempting to promote liberalism or conservatism or a particular ideology to just them being lazy and them not wanting to change things. And as such, they heavily resist any attempts at reform, not even necessarily out of political conviction, but because they don't want to put in the extra work. Like, you could argue at a very base level, that could be one interpretation of the deep state, that there's a lot of bureaucratic inertia, that these people are happy with how things are and they don't want to change and they don't want to have to go through all these reorganizations and stuff like that. They just want to go to work, punch in, punch out. And that could be, you could say that that is an aspect of the deep state or the permanent state, is that just the sheer bureaucratic inertia and the sheer unwillingness of people to change and do more than the minimum amount of effort is kind of the simplest form of the deep state. And generally speaking, depending on the country, in countries that have a professional civil service, most of these people don't change when one government comes in or another. If the government goes from being the conservatives to the liberals or the liberals to the NDP or whatever, they don't just fire everybody within the civil service and reappoint everybody, because the idea is you're supposed to have some sort of technocratic class that is independent from the politics of the moment to ensure kind of a consistency of programming, law enforcement, and even things just like driver's license, is to ensure that that stuff doesn't all get completely reset whenever there's a new government. And to a certain extent, a certain amount of bureaucratic inertia is arguably necessary. Like, do you really want the police to completely change how they police every single time a new government comes to power? Do you want a new government firing every single regulator and then rewriting all the regulations? Do you want like all these kind of things? You generally speaking don't want it. So at a base level, there is a logic to it to prevent elected officials from just completely changing everything. Also, if there was no professional civil service, they could literally just fire everybody. You would have to bring in new people. They would have to learn their jobs. The government might not even last that long. They might have a minority government. They might only last a year. And then when the next government comes to power, they fire everybody all over again. And you just have constant administrative chaos in which nothing can be done. So that's kind of like the most basic, I guess you could say, level of the deep state or the permanent state. And this is something even like mainstream conservatives will talk about it a lot, how there are these unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats that they have no way of getting rid of and who aren't necessarily have to follow whatever it is they're told to do. Like, you can tell a department to do something and they might theoretically agree to do it, but what they might do is just drag their heels in the knowledge that the government will probably lose the next election and then the new government will overturn it. And there isn't really any need for them to fully commit to these things, or they'll do it very superficially, or something like that. Also, a lot of times governments will just implement mandates with no explanation or concept of how it's actually going to work. They'll just say we need to improve nutrition, we need to improve home ownership or something, and there's no actual plan, and they'll just say that to like the bureaucracy. They'll just say just do something like this, and they're left to try to kind of figure out how to do it on their own. So, kind of going to the next level beyond that, you have the idea that there is an inherent ideological component to the bureaucracy. Now, there's a couple different ways you could explain this, but kind of, I guess, the most basic and unobjectionable is most of these people are middle class. They come from a similar cultural background, a similar political background. They went to the same universities. It depends on the country. In some countries, they're just pulled from people who have degrees normally, like a normal bachelor or a normal policing degree or something like that. And in some countries like France, there's specific schools that turn out the top level bureaucrats within the society. But the idea is these people have a common political culture and a common set of political beliefs that more often than not tend to be rather left winged. And because they operate in a organization which everybody has more or less a unified ideology and unified worldview, they will just ignore things that they don't particularly agree with. Like if a conservative government comes to power and they ask them to do something socially conservative, they just won't do it. And there's not a lot really the government can do to compel them to do it. Or they will do it, but because nobody involved actually wants to do it, they will just stymie it or they will obstruct. Like and kind of a more normal conservative example is anytime someone tries to cut the size of government, none of these people want their budgets cut, so they will just do whatever they can to prevent government from cutting their budget, or like maybe, or like if you see government shutdowns in the U.S., what they will often do is they will shut specific things down that are the most visible and make the public suffer the most as a way of basically blackmailing politicians into not cutting things and to letting them go back to power. Or if government passes certain policies that they don't like, they will deliberately implement them in a really bad way. And this is a frustration, particularly with a lot of conservatives who want to cut the size of government, is they come to power and they're unable, or I think a lot of it is a lack of political will and political courage to kind of just go all the way with things. But there is definitely an aspect of the bureaucracy or the permanent state, the literal permanent state, in terms of people who who are permanent employees of the government, to try to throw a monkey wrench in it, to try to prevent them from carrying out their agenda. Once again, I don't think that is a particularly controversial idea. We're just looking at basic human nature. We're looking at the motivations of the people involved, and we're saying let they act in their own interest or in terms of their own worldview. Now, if we get a little deeper into it, we have the I guess kind of the more appointed people. You have certain people. This is particularly true within the government finance sector, who just regardless of who's in power, they seem to just keep getting appointed. The State Department is infamous from this. Someone will move from like deputy secretary of state to like assistant to secretary of state to assistant to the deputy of secretary of state, and stuff like that, and they'll just get moved around. Like the new government won't necessarily replace them, they'll just shuffle around the same people. The same people keep coming back. I think probably the single best example of this, and I covered this a couple days back, but Victoria Nuland resigned, and she was replaced as like the main person for Project Ukraine by the ambassador that oversaw the evacuation from Afghanistan, which I think is universally considered to be a massive disaster. And you have to wonder like why are they putting in charge somebody who's proven themselves to be completely inept, particularly in charge of a situation that has a lot of similarities. And the explanation that people would give is they're part of the permanent state. They're part of the deep state. They are this inner incestuous elite who is able to exert influence on the elected political class and ensure that regardless of who wins the election, they stay in power. And because the same people within the not just the permanent bureaucracy, but the appointed bureaucracy keep getting shuffled around, they're able to keep implementing their particular plans or their particular ideologies. So, regardless of who comes to power, the same group of experts keep getting appointed. This is particularly true with regards to finance. Now, kind of a subsection of this is in a lot of cases there's a revolving door between the private sector and the public sector. So, and once again, this is explicitly bad within the concept of finance. You'll have someone who will be head of the Federal Reserve, and or the head of the SEC or some government regulation, and they'll pass a bunch of regulations or make a bunch of decisions that suspiciously help certain companies, and then they will leave, and then they will go in and work for the company and get a very cushy position with a lot of money, and then they'll come back and they'll get a certain job in government, and that there is this revolving door. And this also works for NGOs who will get themselves money from the government, and then the people will go back to the government. And basically the idea is you see the same like group of people constantly rotated around, and regardless of who's in power, they're always the people who hold the power behind the scenes. And once again, this is not, I think, a particularly controversial statement. You saw a lot of liberals talk about this during the Bush administration, that the tendency was people who, from an industry, who profited off the industry, were in charge of making regulations for that industry, and that there was really very little oversight, and that continues to this day. So those people may not technically be permanent civil servants, but they function in kind of a similar capacity, and they are always there regardless of what happens. If we want to move into like more direct conspiratorial territory, there's the idea that various people within the civil service, army, police force, and stuff like that meet secretly or meet openly, and they have a mutual understanding to pursue a certain agenda or to prevent certain political projects from going on or happening. And to that end, they work as a block. Like, this is particularly true with what happened with Trump. And, like, we're not even talking about, like, crazy stuff here, but it was very obvious, particularly when the BLM riots were happening. The army refused to do what Trump told them to do. The FBI refused to do what Trump told them to do. They just, all these different organizations just at the exact same time refused to basically do what government wanted, and they declared their support for it. And it's a bit like with the media. Like, you notice with the media, all these different publications will come out with basically the same article using the same language at the same time. And it's very hard to not think that there's some sort of collusion going on behind the scenes. And this is often very commonly held view with bureaucracies. So you don't exactly have a council like the Council of the Elders of Zion or the like Committee for Union and Progress, or whatever various deep state group you want to talk about. But you will have various parts of government, the civil service, appointed positions, and stuff like that acting in concert. And you also will get, as part of this, and this was particularly true during the Hoover years, parts of the civil service or government that through blackmail or through tax investigations or through implicit threats are able to control elected politicians. Like, they might come to them and say, well, if you want to defund the FBI, we're going to just start some investigations into you. Or you want to defund the IRS? Well, something like that's going to happen. Or you want to pass certain restrictions, then, okay, then some other stuff is just going to start happening within government that's going to sabotage you. And whether this is a formal agreement or not, the impact of it is that the bureaucracy often will have a veto on whatever it is the elected government wants to do. Now, within some societies, it goes beyond that, and it goes into like there actually is some council or some particular organization that controls the government from behind the scenes. In Pakistan, you have the ISI. In Turkey, the military ran, I don't know if it was a formal organization or not, but the Council of Generals or the General Staff periodically would perform coups to remove governments that they thought were violating the tenets of Kemalism. And they were the deep state, and they were the permanent state, and that was acknowledged, and that was understood, and that was even seen as a feature, not the bug, that you have the deep state there to act as a counterbalance to any politician that is attempting to overturn the existing system. Very often there is a military very often is the military. What a lot of juntas will do is they will put up a civilian government. There'll be like a civilian prime minister. They'll even have elections. But in reality, the junta will control things from behind the scenes. They will have basically a de facto veto over everything the government does, or a whole bunch of influence. And you can't vote out the military. The politicians can't purge the military. They can't replace them. Now, if we want to go beyond the direct people who are directly involved with the state, you can start adding additional groups onto this. You can add on NGOs, you can add on the media, because you'll find that the media, once again, they will just all surprisingly at the same time come out with basically the same article at the exact time it's needed to serve a particular political purpose. Like a politician might be asking the bureaucracy to do something, and then all of the media releases something to try to stir up public opinion, to try to defend the bureaucracy, to defend the status quo, to defend a particular point of view. Or conversely, if it's something that they like, they will come out all at once to try to empower government, to purge the bureaucracy, or to kind of stir up public opinion and to get it on their side. And the idea is that there is this incestuous relationship between people in the civil service, appointed people, and the media, and they will openly or indirectly will work with each other to serve each other's interests. And some way they can help the media is they give them exclusive access, they give them subsidies, stuff like that. And then this extends to like NGOs, wherein the government will fund, or the civil service or whoever will fund certain NGOs that are clearly partisan, even if they're officially unpartisan, to do certain things. A big one is to fund NGOs that help bring illegal immigrants into America, or Planned Parenthood, or stuff like that. And they're technically not part of the government, but they're government funded, government protected, and the government will come to save them if they ever get in any kind of trouble. In return, these organizations have large amounts of money and influence on the media because they're given that by the government, and so they are able to make contributions to political campaigns. So it's this, once again, this incestuous thing where government will give money to certain organizations, then those organizations will fund the campaign of certain politicians, or get people or offer their support or opposition to certain politicians. And it is this like vicious cycle. And so you start taking all these things together. There's also corporations. And once again, another thing is these often people will serve on the board of corporations, will also serving in these NGOs, will also serving in government, and the separation between them is very vague. So we start putting all of these different things together, and you do very quickly start to get a picture of of there being this political force, how united it actually is, and how formal it actually is open to debate, that is controlling government from within. Whether this is simply bureaucratic inertia, whether this is an ideological bent that is shared by the various people because they went to the same universities and watched the same media, or it's something more formal where it's like a corruption agreement wherein the media and government will support each other, and then they will also be supported by corporations because they'll do certain regulations or give subsidies or tax cuts to companies that support them politically, or support certain NGOs who then support politicians. And basically all of this amounts to is that elected officials have very little power over government. And all of these people can basically veto them or ride roughshod over them or more or less can just basically do whatever they want, and there's no check and balance on them. There's no way to remove them. There's no way to, you can't vote them out. You can't fire them because they have certain protections. You can't pass really regulations to prevent them from doing the lobbying and prevent them from going back and forth, because the people who implement the regulations and make the regulations are the same people who are getting money from it and who are benefiting from it. And so I think, I forget who exactly it was, but there was a British politician who said to John Major, "You give the impression of being in office but not in power." And that's a very good way of kind of referring to how the deep state functions, wherein it doesn't matter who gets elected. And so the cynicism with regards to democracy that you'll see is, if somebody whose interests or ideology are different from the deep state or the permanent state, like Donald Trump, actually like Barack Obama, even before he became president, and then immediately became then immediately snaked on his voter base and just became basically a puppet of the establishment. These people might have the best of intentions. They might have plans to try to change the country for the better, or to clean up corruption or stuff like that. But they just can't, they find out they can't do it. Also, like, if we want to get more and more radical into the deep state, you can come up with stuff like the deep state assassinates people, either the FBI kills people, or they have private hitmen or something like that, who take people out, who leak documents, or who try to do their jobs, or things like that, or they pay off criminals to do it, or they try to make it look like a random act of violence. And that seems to be one of the more conspiratorial aspects of it. But part of it is, you don't even necessarily need to do any of that. Is you create the impression that you're going to do that. If you create the fear of that among people who might be your political opponents, that basically does the same thing. Even if you have no way to assassinate people, if you can, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the media that talks about a deep state and that like Enemy of the State or a lot of kind of conspiracy movies aren't sponsored by these people, because they can give the impression that they can do these things. Like, even if they technically can, even if they don't have it, getting people to believe they have that power, getting people to politicians to believe that if they go after them, they're going to get whacked and their families are going to get whacked, basically fulfills the same purpose. So I guess my point is, when we're talking about the deep state, there's a lot of different levels to which whether or not it exists, and it can often kind of be an open question to what level you're actually on. So I know I kind of went all over the place, and I didn't really talk about the more extreme stuff. But the point I'm trying to make, and the point I try to make with a lot of these videos, is you don't necessarily need to go on like full on lizard man, full like QAnon stuff to understand what the deep state is, to understand that it exists. And if you're trying to explain it to someone, you don't necessarily even have to go that far. You can just, I think most people would understand if you say, regulators come from the industry they regulate, they make the rules for the industry that they regulate, and then they go, like, once they're done working in government, they go back to that industry and get paid off based on the various successes they have. It's also like, even a good example of this, if you've seen the movie, I think it's the miniseries Painkiller on Netflix. It's about the introduction of OxyContin, and they just go in basically how the pharmaceutical company just paid off the regulators who made any kind of attempt to stop them or threatened them, or did stuff like that. So I hope you found the video interesting. I hope it was a bit more of a sane, coherent look at the deep state. And that's about all I have to talk about. So God bless everybody and have a great week.